Risk assessments at the organizational tier. At Tier 1, risk assessments support organizational strategies, policies, guidance, and process for managing risk. Risk assessments conducted at Tier 1 focus on organizational operations, assets, and individuals. Comprehensive assessments across mission or business lines. For example, Tier 1 risk assessments may address first, the specific types of threats directed at organizations that may be different from other organizations and how those threats affect policy decisions. Second, systemic weaknesses or deficiencies discovered in multiple organizational information systems capable of being exploited by adversaries. Third, the potential adverse impact on organizations from the loss or compromise of organizational information, either intentionally or unintentionally. And fourth, the use of new information and computing technologies such as mobile and cloud and potential effect on the ability of organizations to successfully carry out their missions or business operations while using those technologies. Organizations-wide assessments of risk can be based solely on the assumptions, constraints, risk tolerances, priorities, and trade-offs established in the risk framing step. For example, derived primarily from Tier 1 activities. However, more realistic and meaningful risk assessments are based on assessments conducted across multiple mission or business lines. For example, derived primarily from Tier 2 activities. The ability of organizations to effectively use Tier 2 risk assessments as inputs to Tier 1 risk assessments is shaped by such consideration as: first, the similarity of organizational missions or business functions and mission or business processes, and second, the degree of autonomy that organizational entities or subcomponents have with respect to parent organizations. In decentralized organizations or organizations with varied missions or business functions and or environments of operation, expert analysis may be needed to normalize the results from Tier 2 risk assessments. Finally, risk assessments at Tier 1 take into consideration the identification of mission essential functions from Continuity of Operations Plans, COOP, prepared by organizations when determining the contribution of Tier 2 risks. Risk assessment results at Tier 1 are communicated to organizational entities at Tier 2 and Tier 3. Risk assessments at the mission or business process tier. At Tier 2, risk assessments support the determination of mission or business process protection and resiliency requirements, and the allocation of those requirements to the enterprise architecture as part of mission or business segments that support mission or business processes. This allocation is accomplished through an information security architecture embedded within the enterprise architecture. Tier 2 risk assessments also inform and guide decisions on whether, how, and when to use information systems for specific mission or business processes, in particular for alternative mission or business processing in the face of compromised information systems. Risk management and associated risk assessment activities at Tier 2 are closely aligned with the development of business continuity plans, BCPs. Tier 2 risk assessments focus on mission or business segments, which typically include multiple information systems with varying degrees of criticality and or sensitivity with regard to core organizational missions or business functions. Risk assessments at the Tier 2 can also focus on information security architecture as a critical component of enterprise architecture to help organizations select common controls inherited by organizational information systems at Tier 3. Risk assessment results produced at Tier 2 are communicated to and shared with organizational entities at Tier 3 to help inform and guide the allocation of security controls to information systems and environments in which those systems operate. Tier 2 risk assessments also provide assessments of the security and risk posture of organizational mission and business processes, which inform assessments of organizational risks at Tier 1. Thus, risk assessment results at Tier 2 are routinely communicated to organizational entities at Tier 1 and Tier 3. Risk assessments at the information system tier. The Tier 2 context and the system development lifecycle determine the purpose of and define the scope of risk assessment activities at Tier 3. While initial risk assessments, for example, risk assessment performed for the first time rather than updating prior risk assessment, can be performed at any phase in the system development lifecycle. Ideally, this assessment should be performed in the initiation phase. In the initiation phase, risk assessments evaluate the anticipated vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions affecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems in the context of the planned environment of operation. Such assessments inform risk response, enabling information system owners or program managers, together with mission or business owners, to make the final decisions about the security controls necessary based on the security categorization and the environment of operation. Risk assessments are also conducted at later phases in the system development lifecycle, updating risk assessment results from earlier phases. This risk assessment results for as built or as deployed information systems typically include descriptions of vulnerabilities in the systems and an assessment of the risk associated with each vulnerability, thereby updating the assessment of vulnerability severity and corrective actions that can be taken to mitigate the risks. The risk assessment results also include an assessment of the overall risk to the organization and the information contained in the information systems by operating the systems as evaluated. Risk assessment results at Tier 3 are communicated to organizational entities at Tier 1 and Tier 2. Risk assessment activities can be integrated with the steps in the risk assessment framework. As defined in NIST Special Publication 800-37, the RMF in its system development lifecycle approach operates primarily at Tier 3, with some application at Tiers 1 and 2, for example in the selection of common controls. Risk assessments can be tailored to each step in the RMF as reflected in the purpose and scope of the assessments described in Section 3.1. Risk assessments can also help determine the type of security assessments conducted during various phases of the system development lifecycle. The frequency of such assessments, the level of rigor applied during the assessments, the assessment methods used, and the types and numbers of objects assessed. The benefit of risk assessments conducted as part of the RMF can be realized from both initial assessments and from updated assessments as described below. RMF Step 1. Categorize. Organizations can use initial risk assessments to make security categorization decisions consistent with the risk management strategy provided by the risk executive function and as a preparatory step to security control selection. Conducting initial risk assessment brings together the available information on threat sources, threat events, vulnerabilities, and predisposing conditions. This enabling organizations to use such information to categorize information and information systems based on known and potential threats to and vulnerabilities in organizational information systems and environments in which those systems operate. Security categorization decisions inform the selection of initial baseline security controls. Baseline security controls serve as the starting point for organizational tailoring and supplementation activities described in the RMF Select step. RMF Step 2. Select. Organizations can use risk assessments to inform and guide the selection of security controls for organizational information systems and environments of operation. After the initial security control baseline is selected based on the security categorization process, the risk assessment results help organizations, first, apply appropriate tailoring guidance to adjust the controls based on the specific mission or business requirements, assumptions, constraints, priorities, trade-offs, or other organization-defined conditions, and second, supplement the controls based on the specific and credible threat information. Threat data from risk assessment provide critical information on adversary capabilities, intent, and targeting that may affect the decisions by organizations regarding the selection of additional security controls, including the associated costs and benefits. Organizations also consider risk assessment results when selecting common controls, typically at Tier 1 and Tier 2 activity. Risk is introduced if the implementation of a common control results in a single point of failure because the control provides a security capability potentially inherited by multiple information systems. As risk assessments are updated and refined, organizations use the results to modify current security control selections based on the most recent threat and vulnerability information available. RMF Step 3. Implement. Organizations can use risk assessment results to identify alternative implementations of selected security controls, for example, considering vulnerabilities inherent in one security control implementation versus another. Some information technology products, system components, or architectural configurations may be more susceptible to certain types of threat sources. These susceptibilities are subsequently addressed during security control development and implementation. In addition, the strength of security mechanisms selected for implementation can take into consideration the threat data from risk assessments. Individual configuration settings for information technology products and system components can eliminate vulnerabilities identified during the analysis of threat events. Risk assessment results also help inform decisions regarding the cost, benefit, and risk trade-offs in using one type of technology versus another, or how security controls are effectively implemented in particular operational environments. For example, when compensating controls must be used due to unavailability of certain technologies. As risk assessments are updated and refined, organizations use their results to help determine if current security control implementations remain effective given changes to the threat space. RMF Step 4. Assess. Organizations can use the results from security control assessments to inform risk assessments. Security control assessments documented in security assessment reports identify vulnerabilities in organizational information systems and the environments in which those systems operate. Partial or complete failure of deployed security controls or the absence of planned controls represents potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited by threat sources. Organizations use the results from risk assessments to help determine the severity of such vulnerabilities, which in turn can guide and inform organizational risk responses. For example, prioritizing risk response activities, establishing milestones for corrective actions. RMF Step 5. Authorize. Organizations can use risk assessments results to provide risk-related information to authorizing officials. The risk responses carried out by organizations based on the risk assessments result in a known security posture of organizational information systems and environments of operation. Risk assessment results provide essential information to enable authorizing officials to make risk-based decisions on whether to operate those systems in the current security posture or take actions to provide additional security controls, thereby further reducing risk to organizational operations and assets, individuals or other organizations or the nation. RMF Step 6. Monitor. Organizations can update risk assessments on an ongoing basis using security-related information from organizational continuous monitoring processes. Continuous monitoring processes evaluate, first, the effectiveness of security controls, second, changes to information systems and environment of operation, and third, compliance to federal legislation, regulations, directives, policies, standards, and guidance. As risk assessments are updated and refined, organizations use the results to update their risk management strategy, thereby incorporating lessons learned into risk management processes, improving responses to risk, and building a solid foundation of threat and vulnerability information tailored to organizational missions or business functions. Risk communications and information sharing. The risk assessment process entails ongoing communications and information sharing among stakeholders to ensure that, first, the inputs to such assessments are as accurate as possible. Second, intermediate assessment results can be used, for example, to support risk assessments at other tiers. And third, the results are meaningful and useful inputs to the risk response step in the risk management process. The manner and form in which risk risks are communicated are an expression of organizational culture as well as legal, regulatory, and contractual constraints. To be effective, communications of information security risks and other risk-related information produced during the risk assessment is consistent with other forms of risk communication within organizations. To maximize the benefit of risk assessments, organizations should establish policies, procedures, and implementing mechanisms to ensure that the information produced during such assessments is effectively communicated and shared across all three risk management tiers. To reinforce the importance of risk communication and information sharing within organizations, the input tables in appendices D, E, F, G, H, and I, for example, threat sources, threat events, vulnerabilities, predisposing conditions, likelihood, impact, and risk, and the recommended elements of a risk assessment report, Appendix K, provide recommendations for risk communications or sharing among the tiers. Targeted risk assessments. Organizations can use targeted risk assessments in which the scope is narrowly defined to produce answers to specific questions. For example, what is the risk associated with relying on a given technology? How should prior assessments of risk be revised based on incidents that have occurred? What new risks can be identified based on knowledge about a newly discovered threat or vulnerability? What informs specific decisions? For example, which risks should be managed at Tier 1 rather than Tier 2 or 3. Organizations may consider assessing risk at Tier 1 and Tier 2 arising from a set of common threats and vulnerabilities applicable to a wide range of organizational information systems. Assessing risk at Tiers 1 and 2 allows organizations to reduce the number of threats and vulnerabilities considered at the individual information system level and develop common risk responses for such organization-wide risks. This approach can support the common control selection process for organizations and increase the efficiency and cost effectiveness of risk assessments across the organization. With respect to all three tiers in the risk management hierarchy, there are no specific requirements with regard to: first, the formality, rigor, or level of detail that characterizes a particular risk assessment. Second, the methodologies, tools, and techniques used to conduct such risk assessments. Third, the format and content of assessment results and any associated reporting mechanism. Organizations have maximum flexibility on how risk assessments are conducted, where such assessments are applied, and how the results will be used. Organizations are encouraged to use the guidance in a manner that most effectively and cost effectively provides the information necessary to senior leaders or executives to facilitate informed risk management decisions. Chapter 3. The process. Conducting risk assessments within organizations. This chapter describes the process of assessing information security risk, including: first, a high-level overview of the risk assessment process. Second, the activities necessary to prepare for risk assessments. Third, the activities necessary to conduct effective risk assessments. Fourth, the activities necessary to communicate the assessment results and share risk-related information. And fifth, the activities necessary to maintain the results of risk assessments on an ongoing basis. The risk assessment process is composed of 4 steps. First, prepare for the assessment. Second, conduct the assessment. Third, communicate assessment results. And fourth, maintain the assessment. Each step is divided into a set of tasks. For each task, supplemental guidance provides additional information for organizations conducting risk assessments. Risk tables and exemplary assessment scales are listed in appropriate tasks and cross-reference to additional, more detailed information in the supporting appendices. Figure 5 illustrates the basic steps in the risk assessment process and highlights the specific tasks for conducting the assessment. Preparing for the risk assessment. The first step in the risk assessment process is to prepare for the assessment. The objective of this step is to establish a context for the risk assessment. This context is established and informed by the results from the risk framing step of the risk management process. Risk framing identifies, for example, organizational information regarding policies and requirements for conducting risk assessments, specific assessment technologies to be employed, procedures for selecting risk factors to be considered, scope of the assessments, rigor of analysis, degree of formality, and requirements that facilitate consistent and repeatable risk determinations across the organization. Organizations use the risk management strategy to the extent practicable to obtain information to prepare for the risk assessment. Preparing for a risk assessment includes the following tasks. First, identify the purpose of the assessment. Second, identify the scope of the assessment. Third, identify the assumptions and constraints associated with the assessment. Fourth, identify the sources of information to be used as inputs to the assessment. And 5. Identify the risk model and analytical approaches, for example, assessment and analysis approaches to be employed during the assessment. Step 1. Prepare for the assessment. Identify purpose. Task 1-1. Identify the purpose of the risk assessment in terms of the information that the assessment is intended to produce and the decisions the assessment is intended to support. Supplemental guidance. The purpose of the risk assessment is explicitly stated in sufficient detail to ensure that the assessment produced the appropriate information and supports the intended decisions. Organizations can provide guidance on how to capture the present information produced during the risk assessment, for example, using a defined organizational template. Appendix K provides an exemplary template for a risk assessment report or the preferred vehicle for risk communication. At Tier 3, risk assessment support. First, authorization-related decisions throughout the system development lifecycle. Second, reciprocity, particularly for reuse of assessment information. Third, risk management activities at Tier 2. And fourth, programmatic risk management activities throughout the system development lifecycle. At Tier 2, risk assessments enable organizations to, first, understand dependencies and ways in which risks are accepted, rejected, shared, transferred, or mitigated among information systems that support organizational mission or business processes. Second, support architectural and operational decisions for organizational risk responses, for example, reducing dependencies, limiting connectivity, enhancing and focusing monitoring, and enhancing information or system resiliency. Third, identify trends so that proactive risk response strategies and courses of action for mission or business processes can be defined. And fourth, support reciprocity, particularly to enable information sharing. At Tier 1, risk assessments first support the risk executive function and 2 serve as a key input to the risk management strategy. In addition to these common purposes, risk assessments may have a very specific purpose to answer a specific question. For example, what are the risk implications of a newly discovered vulnerability or class of vulnerabilities, allowing new connectivity, outsourcing a specific function, or adopting a new technology. Risk assessment results from all tiers can be used by organizations to inform the acquisition process by helping to ensure information security requirements are clearly specified. The purpose of the risk assessment is influenced by whether the assessment is, first, an initial assessment, or second, a subsequent assessment initiated from the risk response or monitoring steps in the risk management process. For initial assessments, the purpose can include, for example, first, establishing a baseline assessment of risk, or second, identifying threats and vulnerabilities, impacts to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation, and other risk factors to be tracked over time as part of risk monitoring. For a reassessment initiated from the risk response step, the purpose can include, for example, providing a comparative analysis of alternative risk responses or answering a specific question. See discussion of targeted risk assessments above. Alternatively, for a reassessment initiated from the risk monitoring step, the purpose can include, for example, updating the risk assessment based on first, ongoing determinations of the effectiveness of security controls in organizational information systems or environments of operation. Second, changes to information systems or environments of operation. For example, changes to hardware, firmware, software, changes to system-specific hybrid or common controls, changes to mission or business processes, common infrastructure and support services, threats, vulnerabilities of facilities. And third, results from compliance verification activities. Reassessments can also be initiated by organizations due to incidents that have occurred. For example, cyber attacks, compromising organizational information or information systems. Identify scope. Task 1-2. Identify the scope of the risk assessment in terms of organizational applicability, timeframe supported, and architectural or technology considerations. Supplemental guidance. The scope of the risk assessment determines what will be considered in the assessment. Risk assessment scope affects the range of information available to make the risk-based decisions and is determined by the organizational official requesting the assessment and the risk management strategy. Establishing the scope of the risk assessment helps organizations to determine first what tiers addresses in the assessment, second, what parts of organizations are affected by the assessment and how they are affected, third, what decisions the assessment results support, fourth, how long assessment results are relevant, and fifth, what influences the need to update the assessment. Establishing the scope of the risk assessment helps to determine the form and content of the risk assessment report, as well as the information to be shared as a result of conducting the assessment. At Tier 3, the scope of risk assessment can depend on the authorization boundary for the information system. Appendix K provides an example of the type of information that may be included in a risk assessment report or the preferred vehicle for risk communication. Organizational applicability. Organizational applicability describes which parts of the organization or sub-organizations are affected by the risk assessment and the risk-based decisions resulting from the assessment, including the parts of the organization or sub-organizations responsible for implementing the activities and tasks related to the decisions. For example, the risk assessment can inform decisions regarding information systems supporting a particular organizational mission or business function or mission or business process. This can include decisions regarding the selection, tailoring, or supplementation of security controls for specific information systems or the selection of common controls. Alternatively, the risk assessment can inform decisions regarding a set of closely related missions or business functions or mission or business processes. The scope of the risk assessment can include not only the missions or business functions, mission or business processes, common infrastructure, or shared services on which the organization currently depends, but also those which the organization might use under specific operational conditions. Effectiveness timeframe. Organizations determine how long the results of particular risk assessment can be used to legitimately inform risk-based decisions. The timeframe is usually related to the purpose of the assessment. For example, a risk assessment to inform Tier 1 policy-related decisions need to be relevant for an extended period of time, since the governance process for policy changes can be time-consuming in many organizations. A risk assessment conducted to inform a Tier 3 decisions on the use of a compensated security control for an information system may be relevant only until the next release of the information technology product providing the required security capability. Organizations determine the useful life of risk assessment results and under what conditions the current assessment results become ineffective or irrelevant. Risk monitoring can be used to help determine the effectiveness of time frames for risk assessments. In addition to risk assessment results, organizations also consider the currency or timelines, for example latency or age, of all types of information or data used in assessing risk. This is of particular concern in information reuse and evaluation the validity of assessment results. Architectural or technology considerations. Organizations use architectural and technology considerations to clarify the scope of the risk assessment. For example, at Tier 3, the scope of the risk assessment can be an organizational information system in its environment of operations. This entails placing the information system in its architectural context, so that vulnerabilities and inherited controls can be taken into considerations. Alternatively, the scope of the assessment can be limited solely to the information system without consideration of inherited vulnerabilities. At Tier 2, the scope of the risk assessment can be defined in terms of the mission or business segment architecture, for example, including all system services and infrastructures that support a specific mission or function. For a targeted risk assessment at any tier, the specific question to be answered can restrict the scope to a specific technology.